Thank you all for being here tonight. This celebration is for each of you.
There is a sound a room makes when it realizes it has made a terrible mistake. It's not loud. It's the opposite of loud. It's 200 people going completely, absolutely silent. And the only thing moving is her. She had been on her knees in this woman's kitchen 6 days ago, scrubbing tile, folding cashmere, making herself small, $14 an hour. 7 months. And now she was standing at the top of the most expensive staircase in Chicago, in a dress that had never been for sale, in a dress that museums had begged to own, in a dress her mother had made. And the woman who had handed her the mop, she was the one who couldn't breathe. This is the story of what happens when someone decides, quietly, without anger, without revenge, to simply remember who they are. Stay with me, because the ending is not what you expect, and it will stay with you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Caroline Ellis, and the first thing you need to understand about Caroline is that she was not the kind of woman who made entrances. She had spent the better part of 4 decades being the kind of woman who made things easier for other people. She was the one who arrived early, who stayed late, who remembered to send the thank you note, to pick up the dry cleaning, to make sure the flowers on the dining room table were changed before guests arrived. She had a gift for disappearing into the smooth running of things, a talent for making comfort feel effortless to the people around her. And for most of her life, she had not stopped to ask herself whether any of those people ever noticed, whether they ever wondered what it cost her, or whether they even saw her at all. Most of them didn't. But that is a truth Caroline had made peace with a long time before the night of the Meridian Gala changed everything she thought she knew about peace. She grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house that always smelled like magnolias and cast iron. Her mother, Ruth, was the kind of woman who ironed her own curtains and kept a garden so precise it looked painted. Her father, Gerald, taught history at a small college outside the city for 31 years. They were not wealthy, but they were careful, and careful, in that household, was its own kind of dignity. Caroline grew up understanding that you did not throw things away, that you repaired what was broken, that you treated people, all people, with a baseline of decency that was not negotiable. She absorbed this the way children absorb the things that are never said aloud, but lived out daily in the rhythm of a home. It became the architecture of who she was. She didn't know yet how rare it was. She didn't know yet how much the world would test it. She left Charleston at 22 with a scholarship to the Savannah College of Art and Design, and a head full of ambitions. She hadn't yet found the courage to name textile design. That was what she wanted. She had known it since she was 9 years old, watching her grandmother piece together quilts on the back porch, those long summer afternoons when time moved slowly enough to see how things were. She had a feel for fabric the way some people have a feel for music. Instinctive, physical, almost spiritual. The weight of a good linen in her hands could tell her things. The drape of a silk said something to her that she couldn't put into language, but didn't. She understood cloth the way other people understood words, and she was good at it. Quietly, completely, undeniably good at it. She graduated with distinction. She got a job at a small textile firm in New York, then a larger one, then began consulting independently for fashion houses and interior design firms across the country. For 15 years, she built a life that looked exactly like what it was, the work of a woman who was gifted, disciplined, and serious about her craft. She got married at 31 to a man named Thomas who was kind and steady in the way that made everything feel possible. They had a daughter named Maya who arrived into the world with her father's quiet temperament and her mother's bone-deep stubbornness. They bought a house in a suburb outside Nashville, Tennessee, and for a long time, a real sustained, generous stretch of time, everything was fine. More than fine, it was good, and then it wasn't. Thomas died on a Tuesday in November, 11 days after his 53rd birthday. Cardiac arrest. No warning, no gradual decline that would have given them time to prepare, to say the things you save for later, to get used to the idea of an ending. He was there and then he wasn't, with the brutal completeness of a door slamming shut. Caroline was 51 years old. Maya was 19 and away at college in Georgia. And the life Caroline had built, that careful, layered, meaningful life, suddenly required her to look at every part of it and figure out what still held without him at its center. She discovered that more of it held than she expected, and that some of it didn't hold at all. The consulting business had slowed in the 2 years before Thomas died. She had pulled back to take care of him through a minor health scare that turned out not to be minor, and then to be with him, and then to grieve in that anticipatory way you grieve when you know something is coming, but can't yet bear to look at it directly. Her client list had thinned. Her savings were more complicated than she'd understood. Thomas had handled the long-term finances, And what she found when she finally sat down with the documents was that their retirement accounts had been drawn on for the medical bills, that the life insurance was less than she'd believed, and that the mortgage had 18 more years on it. She was not destitute, but she was not comfortable. She was in that particular invisible territory that exists between those two states, where you are too financially exposed to breathe easily, but too proud and too private to tell anyone why. She tried to rebuild the consulting work. For 8 months, she sent emails, made calls, reached out to contacts she hadn't spoken to in years, put together a portfolio she was proud of, pursued every lead. She got 2 short contracts. They helped. They were not enough. The market had shifted in the years she'd been away from it. The relationships that had sustained her business before were rusty now, and the industry had moved in directions that required her to retool and reintroduce herself at an age when the world is not especially patient with people who need to start again. She did not give up. She reframed. She told herself it was temporary, that the slow months were just slow months, that the pipeline would open up. But the mortgage didn't care about the pipeline. The electric bill didn't care. The property taxes due in January didn't care at all. So she called a domestic staffing agency, not because it was her first choice, not because she had run out of other ideas entirely, but because it was available and immediate, and because a part of her, the practical, unsentimental part her mother had installed in her, recognized that there was no shame in honest work, any of it. She had watched her grandmother clean houses for extra money. She had watched her mother take in alterations during lean years without a word of complaint. Work was work, and Caroline needed to work. She told herself that. She repeated it on the mornings when it was hard to believe. The agency placed her in several homes across the Chicago suburbs. She had moved to Chicago after Thomas died. Maya was there now, working her first real job out of college, and Caroline had wanted to be closer to her only child. The houses she cleaned were large. The people who owned them were busy and mostly indifferent, which she preferred to the ones who watched her. She learned quickly what the work asked of her: efficiency, invisibility, the ability to make a space feel untouched. She was good at it, as she had been good at most things she put her hands to, but it was physically hard in a way she hadn't anticipated. The hours of kneeling, the reaching, the carrying, the particular exhaustion that comes from being on your feet for 7 hours straight without once being asked whether you need anything. She went home some evenings and soaked her hands in Epsom salts and told herself it was temporary. That was the word she kept returning to: temporary. Her longest placement was with a woman named Victoria Caldwell. Victoria lived in a penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago, the kind of address that communicates its own status before you've rung the bell. The building had a doorman. The lobby had a chandelier. The elevator required a key code. Victoria herself was 44 years old, divorced twice, the founder of a luxury event planning company that organized galas and fundraisers for Chicago's wealthiest families and institutions. She moved through the world with the authority of someone who had decided, early and firmly, that her time was worth more than other people's, not because she had ever examined that belief, simply because no one around her had ever suggested otherwise. She was not openly cruel in the ways that announced themselves. She did not raise her voice. She did not call names. What she did was subtler than that, and in some ways more effective. She spoke to Caroline the way you speak to a task you are managing rather than a person you are addressing. Her sentences were instructions. She offered no pleasantries and expected none in return. She did not ask, she directed. She looked past Caroline in that specific way that some wealthy people look past the people who clean their homes. Not with malice, exactly, but with a kind of trained inattention that communicates, without a single deliberate word, that the person before them does not fully register as a person at all. Caroline noticed. She always noticed. She simply said nothing. She did the work and kept her counsel and watched, as she had always watched, from a position of quiet attentiveness that Victoria had no idea existed. She had been working in that penthouse for 7 months on the afternoon. That Victoria appeared in the doorway of the guest bedroom where Caroline was replacing the duvet cover. 2 women stood behind her, friends by the look of them, the kind of friends whose primary function seems to be witnessing and confirming. Victoria was smiling, not warmly, the kind of smile that is actually a test of something. Caroline straightened and waited. She had learned to wait. Victoria let the silence sit a moment longer than necessary. A small performance, Caroline realized, and then she spoke. She said that she was hosting a table at the Meridian Gala that Saturday. The Meridian Gala, in case you don't know, is Chicago's most exclusive annual charity event. Held at the Meridian Grand Ballroom, a venue so storied and so expensive that even the charity organizations that benefit from it have to apply 2 years in advance to be included. Tickets begin at $8,000 per seat. The guest list is a cross-section of Chicago's financial, cultural, and social elite. People plan their wardrobes months ahead. People compete to be seated at certain tables. It is, in short, the kind of event that means something very specific to people for whom events like this are the currency of social life. Victoria said she had decided to give Caroline a ticket. She said it was exclusive. She said everyone who mattered in the city would be there. She said she thought Caroline deserved a night out. She said, "Wear whatever you have. I'm sure you'll find something appropriate." And then she turned back to her friends before the sentence had finished landing. They made it to the hallway before the laughter started. Caroline heard it. She was meant to hear it. She stood in the guest bedroom with the duvet cover half on and listened to the sound of two women she claimed. Didn't know finding her funny for reasons that had nothing to do with anything she had done. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't even hurt in the sharp, immediate way that cruelty sometimes hurts. What she felt was something older and quieter than hurt. A recognition. A confirmation of something she had suspected for 7 months. That Victoria Caldwell had never once looked at her and seen a person. She had seen a function, a service, a pair of hands that appeared on Tuesdays and Thursdays and disappeared again. And the invitation was not generosity. It was an audience Victoria wanted to watch. She wanted to see what happened when you took the help and put her somewhere she didn't belong, so everyone in the room could understand the difference, so everyone could see. Caroline finished the Dufide cover. She folded the corners precisely, the way her mother had taught her. She smoothed the surface flat. She picked up her cleaning caddy and moved to the next room. Her hands did the work while her mind went somewhere else entirely. She thought about her mother, Ruth, who had pressed those curtains without complaint. She thought about her grandmother, piecing those quilts in the heat of a Carolina summer. She thought about what dignity actually meant. Not where you found it, but whether you kept it when someone tried to take it. She set down her caddy. She took out her phone. She looked at a contact she hadn't called in 2 years. She pressed call. The name in her phone was Margaret Osei, and if you didn't know that name, it only meant you hadn't been paying attention to the right things. Margaret Osei was Caroline's oldest friend. They had met as graduate students at SCAD, two women from different backgrounds who had recognized in each other the same seriousness, the same precision, the same borderline obsessive relationship with fabric and form. They had stayed close across 3 decades in 4 cities and every kind of life change. Margaret had gone a different direction. She had founded a textile and design house in Atlanta in her mid-30s that had grown, steadily and then suddenly, into one of the most respected names in American fashion. Her work had appeared in Vogue, in museum collections, in the wardrobes of women whose names everyone recognized. She was, by any measure, an institution. And she was the woman Caroline called from a penthouse guest bedroom in Chicago on a Tuesday afternoon, with the sound of laughter still fading down the hallway. She didn't explain everything. Margaret had known her for 30 years. She didn't need to, she said. I've been invited somewhere. And then she said, I think I need to remember who I am for one night. There was a silence on the line. Then Margaret said, I'll send you the ivory. Caroline closed her eyes. She knew which one. Everyone who had ever seen it knew which one. The ivory piece was the closing gown from Margaret's most celebrated collection. The one the critics had called a reckoning, the one a museum in Washington had inquired about acquiring for its permanent collection, the one that had never been worn except on the runway in Atlanta under lights so bright. They made the hand-stitched glass beads look like water. Margaret had kept it. She always kept the closing pieces. She said the closing piece was the truest thing she made, the one that carried the whole weight of what she was trying to say in a given year. That dress was not for sale. That dress was not for loan. That dress existed in a category that had nothing to do with commerce, and Margaret was sending it to Chicago on a Thursday morning because her oldest friend had spent 7 months being invisible and deserved for one evening to be fully seen. The package arrived the next afternoon, not by courier, by car, a black car with a driver who buzzed the intercom and waited. The garment case was sealed. Inside it was the ivory dress and a handwritten note from Margaret. You were never small. You were just in a room that didn't know your size. Wear it well. Caroline held the note for a long time. Then she hung the dress on the back of the bedroom door of her small apartment, the apartment that had been temporary for 14 months now, and looked at it in the afternoon light coming through the window. The glass beads caught the light and scattered it across the walls. It was, objectively, one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. And for the first time, Namas died, since the business slowed, since the agency placements, and the kneeling and the folding, and the deliberate invisibility of 7 months in someone else's home. For the first time in what felt like a very long time, Caroline Ellis did not feel small. She arrived at the Meridian Grand Ballroom at 8:15, which was deliberately late enough that the room would be full and settled and paying attention to itself rather than to the door. The building was lit from outside, warm gold against the Chicago night. The doorman opened the door before she reached it. She walked through the lobby with the particular ease of a woman who had walked into rooms like this for 30 years. Not as a guest always, but as someone who had always known which rooms mattered and why, and who had never needed the rooms to confirm her worth. She took the elevator to the ballroom level. The doors opened. She heard the orchestra before she saw the crowd. She smoothed the dress once, lightly, the waist. Then she stepped forward. She had not planned the staircase moment. She hadn't known the ballroom was built the way it was built, with the entrance above the floor, requiring guests to descend the curved marble staircase that served as an unintentional stage for anyone who arrived. She didn't know until she was standing at the top of it, with the ballroom spread below her and every face in that particular cascade of notice that moves through crowds like a wave turning toward her. She didn't perform it. She simply descended, one hand lightly on the rail, not for support, from habit. Her posture the way her mother had always insisted it should be. Her face the way it was when she was thinking clearly. Calm, present, engaged with something only she could see. She was not thinking about Victoria. She was not thinking about the laughter in the hallway. She was thinking, as she sometimes did in the moments that mattered most, about her grandmother's hands, about what they had made, about what got carried forward and what got left behind. The room changed. There is no other way to describe it. The conversation stopped, not all at once, but in a spreading quiet, the way silence moves when something interrupts the ordinary frequency of a room. Heads turned. Phones came up without people seeming to realize they'd raised them. A man near the bar set down his drink and appeared not to notice he'd done it. Someone to the left of the staircase said very quietly, to no one in particular, "What is that dress?" Someone else said, "I know that dress." A woman in a silver gown, with the erect posture of someone who had spent 40 years attending events like this, said, in the particular hushed register of genuine, "Shock, that's an OC original. I saw it on the runway in Atlanta. That dress is not for sale. That dress has never been for sale." And then she pressed her lips together as if she'd said too much. Victoria Caldwell was standing at a table near the center of the room. Caroline saw her from the staircase. She saw the moment Victoria recognized her. The fraction of a second before Victoria's face rearranged itself, the raw confusion that crossed her features, when her brain could not immediately reconcile the two images. The woman who cleaned her bathrooms, the woman in the dress that the room had stopped for. The two images refused to sit beside each other. Victoria's champagne glass was halfway to her lips and stayed out there. Her friends had gone quiet. One of them had stepped back without meaning to, that involuntary retreat that happens when the ground shifts under you. Caroline descended the last of the stairs. She walked across the ballroom floor with the same steadiness she had walked across every floor in every room she had ever entered, from her grandmother's back porch to the studios of design houses in New York, to the tiled kitchens of other people's homes. She was not performing. She was not punishing. She was simply arriving. She stopped in front of Victoria. She looked at her directly, the way she had stopped doing 7 months ago, because she had learned, in that apartment, that direct eye contact was not expected of the help. She let herself look now. Victoria could not hold it. She looked at the dress instead. That was almost worse, because she knew. They both knew what the dress meant, and they both knew what that meant about everything that had come before. Caroline said, "Good evening, Victoria." Her voice was even. Not cold, not triumphant, even. She said, "Thank you for the invitation. This was very generous of you." Victoria's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Caroline touched the dress once, lightly at the waist, and said, "You told me to wear whatever I had. I hope this is appropriate." And then she excused herself and moved toward the bar, leaving Victoria standing in the middle of the room, with her champagne still raised and her friends still silent, and the understanding settling over her, slow and complete, like something heavy being lowered from a height. The woman 2 steps to Victoria's left said, her voice barely a breath, "Where did she get that dress?" Someone answered, "I just told you. That's an OC piece. Margaret OC, the designer." The woman said, "But that's the runway piece. How does the cleaning woman have a runway piece from Margaret OC?" And then someone else, who had been listening and putting things together with the particular speed of people who move in certain circles and know certain names, said, "I think I understand," and turned toward Victoria with an expression that Victoria would remember for the rest of the evening. Victoria spent the next hour watching Caroline Ellis move through the room. It was the most instructive hour of her adult life, and she would not have described it that way at the time. At the time, she would have described it as the worst evening she had ever attended. But she watched. Because you watch the thing that has rearranged your understanding of reality. You watch to try to make sense of it. And what she watched was this: a woman she had handed a mop to 6 days earlier, standing in conversation with the editor of one of the country's most respected design publications, who was leaning forward with the particular attentiveness of someone talking to someone they genuinely find interesting. She watched Caroline cross the room and speak easily with the chairwoman of the charity they were all there to support, and the two of them laughing together at something, the real laughter that doesn't perform itself. She watched two developers approach Caroline, men Victoria had been trying to secure meetings with for the better part of a year, and introduce themselves to her with the kind of deference that is instinctive and can't be manufactured, the deference you offer someone whose context you have just understood. She watched all of it. She held her champagne glass and she watched and she understood incrementally what she had done. Her husband, Robert, found her near the back wall of the room an hour into this. Robert Caldwell was 50 years old and had built a commercial real estate company over 20 years through a combination of precision and patience. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned close and said quietly, "Tell me what happened tonight." And Victoria, because she had learned over 14 years of marriage that Robert could see through every version of a managed story she might offer, told him. She had given the ticket to her housekeeper. She had meant it as something amusing she hadn't known. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were cruel to her." "For how long?" Victoria said, 7 months. Robert was quiet again. Then he said, "The woman in the dress. What's her name?" Victoria said, "Caroline." Robert said, "Find out her last name tomorrow. Fix this. Not because of the dress or the connections. Fix it because what you described doing is not who I thought you were." He straightened his jacket and walked back toward the room and left Victoria standing there with those words in the space he'd vacated. She waited until the crowd around Caroline had thinned toward the end of the evening. Then she walked across the ballroom floor. It felt longer than it was. She had walked this floor at this gala 4 years in a row. She had never noticed how long it was before. Caroline saw her coming and waited without moving, without changing her expression, without signaling anything. Victoria stopped in front of her. The words she had prepared on the walk across the room were gone. What was left was something smaller and rawer and more honest than anything she'd planned to say. She said, "I owe you an apology. I knew what I was doing when I invited you. I wanted to see you uncomfortable. I've treated you badly since the first week. I'm sorry. That's not an excuse. I'm sorry." The silence that followed was the longest one she could remember standing in. Caroline looked at her steadily. She said, "I know. And she said it the way you say something you have known for a long time and have been waiting for the other person to catch up to." Then Caroline said something that Victoria had not expected. She said, "I forgive you." She said it plainly, without ceremony, the way you state a fact. And then she said, "But I want you to understand what tonight was actually about. Not what happened to me, what it showed about you. You weren't cruel to me because of anything I am or anything I did. You were cruel to me because you had decided that I couldn't respond, that I was safe to be unkind to, that I was in a position where your behavior had no consequences. And that belief, that there are people you can treat however you want because of where they stand in relation to you, that's the thing you have to look at, not the dress, not who I turned out to be. The belief, because I am not the only person you have treated this way. I'm just the one who had a gown in her closet." Victoria could not speak. She nodded. She stood there and she nodded, and she let it land. All of it. Caroline said, "I hope your evening improves." And then she turned and walked back into the party, and Victoria stood in that corner for a very long time, listening to the orchestra and looking at her own reflection in the dark window behind her. The morning after the gala, Caroline woke up in her small apartment and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, where she did most of her thinking. The dress was back on its hanger. The apartment was quiet. Mai had called the night before, laughing, saying someone she knew had been at the gala and had texted her about a woman in an impossible gown and how the whole room had stopped. And Maya had said, "Mom, was that you?" And Caroline had said yes, and Maya had gone quiet for a moment and then said, "Good, just good." Caroline drank her coffee and thought about what good meant in that context and decided it meant something more than the dress and the staircase and the room going quiet. It meant, "I'm glad you remembered. I'm glad you let them see." She thought about her grandmother's quilts. She thought about what her mother had ironed into those curtains, not just the creases, but the belief that how you maintain things mattered, that care was a form of dignity, that the work of your hands said something true about you, regardless of whether anyone was watching. She thought about 7 months of being invisible in a penthouse on the Gold Coast and what she had learned there, about how people are when they think no one who matters is watching, about who she was when the mirrors were taken away. She called the staffing agency that Monday and gave her notice, not because of the gala. She had already decided before the gala. The gala had only clarified the timing. She had spent 14 months telling herself the cleaning work was temporary, and she had been right, but temporary had taken longer than she'd planned because she'd been afraid. Afraid that the consulting market had moved on without her. Afraid that 52 was too late to begin again. Afraid in the ordinary persistent way that grief makes you afraid. Not of death, but of visibility, of taking up space, of wanting something and not getting it, and having to feel that in a body that had already felt too much. The gala had not made her brave. She had been brave the whole time. The gala had made her remember that she knew it. She rebuilt the consulting business over the following year. It was not fast and it was not easy, and there were months that required a discipline she had to dig for. But she had spent 7 months on her knees in other people's homes noticing things about fabric, about texture, about the way light moved across surfaces, about the particular way wealthy women related to the things they wore and the spaces they inhabited. She had been observing, as she had always observed, from her position of careful invisibility, and what she brought back to her consulting work was richer and stranger and more fully human than what she'd left with. She had been in the rooms everyone else's rooms were designed to impress. She had seen what those rooms actually looked like when the guests were gone. She had touched the fabric when no one was watching. She knew things now that you couldn't know any other way. And her clients, the ones who found her through the network she quietly began to rebuild, could feel it. There was a specificity to her work, a groundedness, an authority that came from somewhere different than it had before. They couldn't always name it, but they felt it, and they came back. 8 months after the gala, Caroline received an email from Margaret. Margaret was launching a new collection, and she wanted to do something she had never done before. She wanted to create a line designed in collaboration with domestic workers, housekeepers, nannies, personal assistants, the women and men whose labor made the lives of the wealthy possible, but who were almost never credited with any of the comfort they created. She wanted the collection to carry their stories. She wanted the front row of the Paris launch to be filled with 50 domestic workers who had never attended a fashion show in their lives. She wanted a portion of every sale to go directly to a scholarship fund for their children. She wanted Caroline's expertise, Caroline's eye, and Caroline's network within the domestic worker community she had spent 7 months becoming part of. She called it, provisionally, the invisible line. She wanted Caroline to be the consulting director. Caroline said yes before the email was fully read. The launch was held in Paris, in a private venue near the Seine, on a night in early spring, when the city was still cool enough to warrant the kind of dressing that fashion required. Margaret stood at the door in a red dress that had taken 3 months to construct, greeting every arrival with the particular warmth of a woman who had built an empire and never once forgotten what it was built on. The work of human hands, the care of specific people, the particular intelligence that lives in the body and not on the page. The front row was everything Margaret had promised. 50 people who had spent their careers making other people's lives beautiful without ever being, offered a seat at the table of beauty. They sat in the front row of a Paris fashion show, dressed in pieces from the collection, pieces that had been designed around their stories and their needs, and their specific non-negotiable humanity. And when the models came out, wearing the rest of the collection, some of them had their hands pressed to their mouths. A woman in the third seat from the left was crying quietly, with no particular effort to stop. Margaret had told Caroline before the show began, if I never do anything else, this was enough. This was the whole point. Caroline stood backstage through most of the show, watching through a gap in the curtain. She watched the faces in the front row. She watched 50 people discover that someone had seen them, that someone had put the weight of their years and the reality of their work and the breadth of who they were into something made with hands and care and intention. Something that said, you are not invisible, you were never invisible. We just hadn't built the room that could hold you yet. This is that room. Come in. After the show, when the venue had opened for the reception, and the front row guests were laughing and talking and taking photographs with Margaret and with each other, Caroline moved through the crowd and found herself stopping in front of a face she had not expected to see. Victoria Caldwell was standing near the back wall holding her champagne glass with both hands, looking at the exhibition panels that lined the walls. Photographs of domestic workers from 12 countries, each one captioned with their name, their years of service, and what they were working toward for their children. Victoria had been looking at one panel for a long time. Caroline walked over. Victoria turned. Her eyes were red at the corners. She said, I flew over. I needed to see it. She gestured at the room, at the front row, at the photographs, at everything. She said, I needed to see what you built from what I tried to break. She said it with the clean, uncomfortable honesty of someone who had been working on something, who had spent 8 months sitting with what was said to them in a corner of a ballroom and deciding slowly and without shortcuts to take it seriously. Caroline stood beside her and looked at the panel Victoria had been studying. The photograph showed a woman in her late 50s. She had been a hotel housekeeper for 23 years. The caption read, she put 2 children through nursing school. She never told them how hard it was. Caroline was quiet. Victoria said, when you walked into that ballroom, I thought you came to destroy me. I had every reason to. You knew that, you could have, and you didn't. Caroline said, destroying you wasn't the point. The point was that the room needed to see what it looks like when you assume someone is beneath you and you're wrong. Not wrong because she turned out to have the right connections. Wrong because she was a person. That's all it ever takes. She was a person before the dress and after the dress, and she would have been a person in a coat from a thrift store. That's the thing I needed the room to understand, not my resume. Me, Victoria nodded. That slow, deliberate nod of someone filing something away in a permanent place. Victoria told her she had been volunteering since September at a workforce training center on the south side of Chicago that helped women re-enter the job market after periods of unemployment or caregiving. She said it was uncomfortable in ways she had not anticipated, that she kept discovering how small her world had actually been, how many assumptions she had carried without knowing she was carrying them, that the discomfort was ongoing, and she was learning to stay with it rather than step around it. Caroline said, stay with it. That's where the actual change happens, not in the decision to be better, in the daily, uncomfortable, humbling practice of it. Victoria said, I know that now, and I wouldn't have without you. Without that night, Caroline picked up 2 glasses from a passing tray and handed one to Victoria. She said, we're all still becoming who we're going to be, every one of us. They touched glasses. The photograph of the woman who had put 2 children through nursing school watched from the wall. Caroline flew home the next morning. The spring light was sharp over the Atlantic. She sat by the window and looked at the clouds and thought about all the things that had led to this moment, the Magnolia House in Charleston, the quilting grandmother, the 30 years of careful work, the marriage, the loss, difficult and humbling months in other people's homes, the staircase, the dress, the conversation in the corner that had mattered more than any gown ever could. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not performed, not managed. Seen, in the full, specific, unedited sense of that word. She thought about the woman in the photograph. 23 years, 2 children through nursing school. Never told them how hard it was. She thought about how many women there were whose names belonged in permanent places and who had never been put there. She thought about what it meant to do that, to find the names and make them permanent. She thought about her grandmother's hands, about what gets carried forward, about the particular, irreplaceable weight of work, done with care in rooms where no one is watching. She landed in Chicago in the late afternoon. Maya picked her up from the airport. They drove home through the city with the windows down because it was the first warm evening of the year, that specific Chicago warmth that means something after a long winter. And Maya had the music playing and was talking about something. A project at work, a friend she wanted Caroline to meet, ordinary life moving forward in its ordinary way. And Caroline listened and watched the city go by and felt for the first time in years, not temporary, she felt like herself. Not the version of herself that the penthouse had required. Not the version that the grief had reduced her to. Not the version that had climbed that staircase with something to prove. The version underneath all of those versions. The one her grandmother had assembled, stitch by stitch, on a back porch in the Carolina heat. The one her mother had pressed into shape. The one that had been through all of it continuous and whole in hers. She made a note on her phone before she got out of the car. It said, find out the names. Make them permanent. Then she got out of the car and went inside. She had work to do. Here's what this story asks us to sit with, not the dress. The dress is just the vehicle. What this story is about is something older and more necessary than any gown. It is about the precise, consequential way we decide who deserves to be seen, who gets treated as a full human being and who gets treated as a function, who we are careful with and who we are careless with, and whether we have ever stopped to examine the difference. Caroline Ellis spent 7 months in a penthouse being invisible, not because she was invisible, because someone had decided she was, because someone had looked at the position she was in at that particular moment in her life and concluded that the position was the person, that where you are is who you are, that what you do for money is what you are worth. And that is a conclusion that billions of people live inside of every day, not because it is true, because it is convenient, because it makes the world easier to navigate if you can assign people to categories and keep them there. Caroline's story is not a fantasy about a housekeeper who turned out to be important. It is something far more demanding than that. It is a story about a woman who was always important, always capable, always full, always worthy of being treated with basic human decency, and who the room only stopped for because of the dress. That is not the happy ending. That is the problem the story is asking you to take home. Look at the rooms in your own life. Look at the people in them who move through without you fully registering them. The person who delivers your packages. The woman who cleans the office at 6 in the morning before you arrive. The man who parks your car. The one who makes your coffee precisely the way you like it, and whose name you have never asked. Look at the positions in your life. that you have treated as the whole story of the people inside them. And ask yourself, if you knew who they actually were, if you could see the full arc of the life they carry in and out of your peripheral vision, every day, would you treat them differently? Because if the answer is yes, then the question you have to live with is this: why are you waiting to know? The measure of who you are is not what you have. It is not the address or the title or the invitation or the gown. It is who you remain when everything is stripped away, and how you treat the people who never had any of it to begin with.